The call came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky feels too heavy, pressing down like it knows something you don't. I was half asleep, groggy from a night of cheap beer and bad TV, when my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Ethan Grayson?" The voice was crisp, official. "Yeah," I croaked, trying to shake off the sleep. "Who's this?" "This is Deputy Collins from Ashford County. I'm sorry to inform you that your father, Thomas Grayson, passed away last night." I sat up, the words hitting me like ice water. It had been years since I'd spoken to my father, years since I'd even thought about him without bitterness. But hearing that he was gone felt like a sucker punch. I barely managed a week. How? There was an accident. His car went off the road near Grayson Hollow. The deputy's voice softened. "We're still piecing things together." Grayson Hollow. Even the name of that place sent a chill through me. Memories of damp woods, creaking floorboards, and that cold, unblinking stare my grandfather always seemed to wear. I hadn't been back to Ashford since I was a kid, and I never planned to. But life had other ideas. By the time I hung up, the numbness had settled in. I stared at the peeling wallpaper of my apartment, wondering if this was supposed to feel more final. But all I felt was empty. 2 days later, I was on the road, driving my beat-up Honda through winding, tree-choked roads that seemed to stretch on forever. Ashford hadn't changed much. Same towering pines, same mist that clung to the ground like it had nowhere else to go. The closer I got, the more the air felt heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. When I finally pulled up to my father's old house, our old house, it was like stepping into a memory I didn't want. The paint was more chipped, the porch sagged a little lower, but it was still the same place. The kind of house that creaks even when no one's around, like it's whispering secrets to itself. And there, standing on the porch, was him, Dr. Malcolm Grayson, my grandfather. He hadn't aged a day past what I remembered. Tall, straight-backed, with a sharp jawline and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through you. His face was lined, but not in the soft, grandfatherly way you'd expect. These lines were carved from stone, deep and unyielding. "You're late," he said, his voice low and gruff, like gravel underfoot. I stepped out of the car, slamming the door harder than necessary. Didn't realize I was on a schedule. He didn't smile, didn't even flinch. Just stared at me like I was another piece of the puzzle he'd been waiting to solve. "Your father's things are inside," he finally said, turning towards the door. "We've got work to do." Work? The man hadn't seen me in over a decade, and now we were partners in grief? But curiosity got the better of me. That, and the fact that there was nowhere else to go. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you've left. The furniture was covered in sheets, ghostly shapes of a life long abandoned. But it wasn't the house that unnerved me. It was the silence, the kind that settled in your bones. We worked in silence, sorting through my father's things, old photos, yellowed papers, boxes of junk that meant nothing to me. But the more I dug, the more I felt this gnawing unease, like something wasn't right. My father's handwriting was different, shaky, erratic. His journals were filled with ramblings about intruders, people who weren't really people. "They're everywhere," one entry read. "Watching, waiting. Malcolm was right." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Malcolm was right? I glanced up at my grandfather, who was methodically packing away books like he hadn't just been named in the paranoid scribblings of a man losing his mind. "What is this?" I asked, holding up the journal. He didn't even look. "Your father had a lot of demons." "Yeah? And you're not one of them?" That got his attention. He looked at me then, those cold gray eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker there. Regret? Sadness? But it was gone just as quickly. "There are things you don't understand, Ethan," he said quietly. "Things your father got too close to." I scoffed. "Like what? Aliens? Ghosts?" But he didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. Just turned back to the boxes like the conversation was over. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too alive, every creak and groan a whisper just out of earshot. I found myself staring at the ceiling, the words from my father's journal echoing in my head. They're everywhere. I got up, needing some air. The forest behind the house was thick, the trees stretching up like skeletal fingers against the night sky. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. And that's when I saw him. My grandfather. He was hauling someone, over his shoulder. A large, limp shape wrapped in a dark tarp. My heart slammed against my ribs as I crouched behind a tree, watching him disappear into the woods. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I had to know. I waited until he was out of sight before following, my footsteps light on the forest floor. The deeper I went, the colder it felt, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I found him in a clearing, kneeling beside a shallow grave. The tarp was half unwrapped, revealing a woman's pale, lifeless face. But it wasn't the death that froze me in place. It was the way she looked. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't human. They glowed faintly in the dark, like an animal caught in headlights. And her skin, it was too smooth, too perfect, like it was stretched over something that didn't quite fit. My grandfather didn't hesitate. He pulled out a hunting knife, his hands steady as he drove the blade into her chest. There was no blood, no sound, just the sickening crunch of bone as he carved her open. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. He turned then, his eyes meeting mine across the clearing, and he smiled. Not the warm, grandfatherly kind of smile, but the kind that said, "I know you saw, and I don't care." "Ethan," he called, his voice calm, steady. "We need to talk." For a second, I thought about running, just bolting back through the woods and never looking back. But my legs wouldn't move. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, but I was rooted to the spot, staring at the man who had just murdered someone, or something, right in front of me. "Ethan," my grandfather repeated, his voice calm, almost patient, like he was inviting me to sit down for coffee. "Come here." I didn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That woman, if she was a woman, didn't bleed. Her eyes, that skin, it wasn't normal. But murder was murder, right? No matter what he claimed. Malcolm sighed, standing slowly. He left the knife buried in her chest as he wiped his hands on a cloth pulled from his pocket, like it was just another chore, nothing more than cleaning up after dinner. "I know what you're thinking," he said, taking a step toward me, "but you don't understand. You saw what she was." I shook my head, finally finding my voice. "I saw you kill her." "She wasn't human." His words were firm, unwavering. "They're not like us, Ethan. They look like us, they act like us, but they're not." "That's insane." "Is it?" He pointed back to the body. "Did she bleed?" I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped. No, she hadn't bled. But that didn't mean anything, right? Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I hadn't seen it clearly enough. My mind scrambled for explanations, for something that made more sense than monsters living among us. "You've been away too long," Malcolm continued, taking another step closer. "You've forgotten what this town is, what we are." "I haven't forgotten anything," I snapped, backing up instinctively. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. "You're insane. That's what this is." He stopped, his face unreadable. For a moment, the forest was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Then he spoke, softer this time. "I thought the same thing once." His eyes darkened. "When I first learned the truth, I thought I was going mad, but I wasn't, and neither are you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and something else. Something I didn't want to admit. A sliver of doubt. Because as much as I wanted to believe my grandfather was just an old man who'd finally lost his grip on reality, those eyes, that skin, it wasn't normal. And the journals I found in my father's things, they all pointed to something darker, something impossible. But I wasn't ready to face that. Not yet. Malcolm seemed to sense my hesitation. He nodded toward the body, his expression softening just a fraction. "Come see for yourself." "No. I'm not going to hurt you, Ethan. His voice was steady, patient. But you need to understand. I swallowed hard, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct told me to turn around and run, but something stronger, curiosity maybe, or some deep, twisted need to know, kept me rooted in place. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped into the clearing. The woman's body was still there, lying unnaturally still in the dirt. The knife was buried deep in her chest, the handle glinting in the moonlight. I could see her face more clearly now, too smooth, too perfect, like a mannequin brought to life. Her eyes were open, wide and glassy, but they didn't look dead. They looked wrong, like something behind them was still watching, still aware. I felt bile rise in my throat. "Look at her skin," Malcolm murmured, stepping beside me. "It's not real. It's a mask." I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to scream at him, call him a liar, a murderer. But as I stared at that unnatural face, I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What are they?" I whispered, hating myself for even asking. "They call themselves many things," Malcolm replied quietly. "But they're not from here. They've been hiding among us for decades, maybe longer, taking our faces, pretending." "Why?" My voice was barely a whisper. "To survive." His jaw clenched. "And to feed." I shuddered, tearing my eyes away from the corpse. None of this made sense. It couldn't make sense. But the horror on the ground in front of me was undeniable. "You're saying these things are everywhere?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Not everywhere." Malcolm's eyes darkened. "But enough. Enough to make a difference." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, trying to find a foothold in the chaos. But there was no ground to stand on, just the awful, impossible truth. "They killed your father," Malcolm said quietly. I jerked my head toward him. "What?" He got too close, started asking questions, poking around where he shouldn't have. Malcolm's voice was low, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or guilt. They made it look like an accident, but it wasn't. I stared at him, trying to process his words. My father, dead because of these things? It sounded insane. But then again, so did everything else. "How do you know?" I whispered. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Because I've seen it before." The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating. I didn't know what to believe anymore. My mind screamed that this was madness, but my heart whispered that it might be true. "What do we do?" I asked before I could stop myself. Malcolm met my eyes, his gaze steady and unflinching. "We finish what I started." Back at the house, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in. I followed Malcolm inside, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen in the woods. He led me to the basement, a place I hadn't been since I was a kid. It was colder down there, the air damp and musty. He flipped on a single bare bulb, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. In the corner, under a dusty tarp, was a wooden chest. Malcolm pulled it open, revealing an arsenal that made my blood run cold. Guns, knives, strange tools I didn't recognize. But what caught my eye was the book, thick, leather-bound, and covered in strange symbols. "This is your inheritance," Malcolm said quietly. "Not the house, not the land. This." I stared at him, at the weapons, at the book. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing like a war drum in my ears. "You expect me to, what, become a monster hunter?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "I expect you to survive." And as much as I wanted to deny it, to walk away and forget any of this ever happened, deep down I knew the truth. There was no walking away, not anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Even after we locked the basement door and Malcolm disappeared into his room, I sat in the living room, staring at the fireplace, though there was no fire burning. The house groaned around me, as if it too was trying to process what I'd seen. The woman's face, if you could even call her that, haunted me. Those glassy, unnatural eyes, the way her skin stretched over something that didn't fit right. No blood, no struggle, just emptiness. Not human. The words echoed in my head, but no matter how many times I repeated them, They didn't feel real. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Some twisted coincidence, some elaborate misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. And worse, I knew Malcolm wasn't crazy. By the time the sun started to rise, painting the sky in muted purples and grays, I was still awake, still trying to convince myself that when I opened my eyes again, this would all be a bad dream. But it wasn't. Malcolm was already in the kitchen when I finally dragged myself from the couch, his movements methodical as he poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. The scent was strong, bitter, and somehow grounding in the midst of everything. Without saying a word, he slid one of the mugs across the table to me. I stared at it for a moment before wrapping my hands around it, letting the heat seep into my fingers. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the distant chirping of birds outside, oblivious to the horror lingering in these walls. Finally, I broke the silence. What happens now? Malcolm didn't look up from his coffee. We prepare. For what? He finally met my eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made my stomach twist. For them. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of coffee suddenly sharp on my tongue. You think they're coming? I know they are. His voice was steady, calm, like he was discussing the weather. When you take one of them out, the others notice. They'll come looking. I set my mug down, my pulse quickening. And what if we leave? What if we get out of here before they do? Malcolm shook his head. It's not that simple. Running won't stop them. It'll only delay the inevitable. They'll find us, no matter where we go. He paused, his expression darkening. They've already found you. The weight of his words settled over me like a stone. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. Ever since I arrived in Ashford, something had felt off. The town wasn't just strange, it was watching. What do they want? I asked quietly. Malcolm's jaw tightened. To replace us. The simplicity of his answer made it all the more chilling. I didn't ask any more questions after that. We spent the day in the basement. Malcolm showed me how to load the guns, how to hold the knives. But there were other weapons too, things I didn't recognize. Strange metal rods etched with symbols, vials of dark liquid, and small hand-carved wooden stakes that looked more ceremonial than practical. These aren't just for killing, Malcolm explained, handing me one of the metal rods. Some of them can't be killed the way you'd expect. You have to weaken them first, expose what they really are. I turned the rod over in my hands, feeling the strange hum of energy vibrating beneath the surface. What are they, really? Malcolm's eyes darkened. Parasites. They attach themselves to people, sometimes for years, until they've drained everything they need. Then they move on to the next host. And if they don't find a host, they die. He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. I didn't ask what happened to the hosts. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. By nightfall, we were ready, or at least Malcolm was ready. I felt like a kid playing dress-up in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My hands trembled as I checked the safety on the pistol for the 10th time, the cold metal unfamiliar and unwelcome in my grip. You need to calm down, Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. If you panic, you're dead. Easy for you to say, I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. You've been doing this for years. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was softer than I expected. You think I don't get scared? He met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something raw beneath that steely exterior. Fear keeps you sharp, but you can't let it control you. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. We didn't have to wait long. It started with the lights, a flicker, barely noticeable at first, then a sudden, sharp surge as the bulbs overhead popped, plunging the house into darkness. I felt my heart seize in my chest, every muscle tensing as I gripped the pistol tighter. Stay close, Malcolm whispered, his silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of the moon, filtering through the basement window. He moved with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from years of practice, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. I followed, every nerve in my body on high alert. The house above us was silent, too silent. Even the usual creaks and groans were gone, swallowed by an oppressive stillness that made the air feel thick, heavy. Then we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. It was coming from the kitchen. Malcolm motioned for me to stay back as he crept up the basement stairs. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I held my breath, waiting for a sign, any sign, that this was all just a misunderstanding. But when Malcolm reached the top of the stairs, he froze. "They're here," he whispered. The words barely left his mouth before the front door burst open with a deafening crash. I stumbled back, my heart lurching into my throat as heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Shadows moved in the darkness, their forms shifting, unnatural. Malcolm fired first. The gunshot was loud in the confined space, the recoil jolting me back to reality. I raised my own weapon, my hands shaking, as I aimed at the figure barreling down the stairs. I squeezed the trigger. The shot hit, but the figure didn't fall. It twitched, like it was annoyed more than hurt, and kept coming. I fired again and again until the clip was empty. The figure staggered, collapsing halfway down the stairs with a sickening thud. For a moment, there was silence. Then the thing twitched again and began to get up. "Now!" Malcolm shouted, tossing me one of the metal rods. I didn't think, I just acted. I drove the rod into the creature's chest, right where its heart should have been. The moment the metal touched its skin, the thing let out a sound I'll never forget. A high-pitched, inhuman screech that made my skin crawl. Its body convulsed violently before collapsing into a heap, unmoving. I stood there, panting, staring down at the thing on the floor. It wasn't human, not anymore. And neither was the nightmare we'd just stepped into. The creature's body lay twisted at the bottom of the stairs, its limbs contorted in ways no humans ever could be. Its skin had begun to crack, revealing something darker, something that shimmered faintly under the moonlight seeping in through the broken window. I stared down at it, my breathing ragged, my mind struggling to process what I'd just done. It wasn't just the fact that I'd killed something, it was the fact that I had no idea what I'd killed. Malcolm stepped beside me, his face grim but steady. "You did good," he muttered, nudging the thing's body with his boot. The skin split further, peeling away like wet paper to reveal sinewy muscle that didn't look remotely human. "Good?" I echoed, my voice hoarse. "I shot it, twice, and it kept coming. How is that good?" "It's dead now, isn't it?" He knelt down, retrieving the metal rod from its chest. It slid out with a sickening squelch, and the body twitched one final time before going still. "That's all that matters." I swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear lingering on my tongue. What was that?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He studied the creature's face, or what was left of it, as if searching for something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "That," he said, "was just the beginning." We spent the rest of the night clearing the house, checking every shadow, every creak and groan. But there were no more intruders, just the one. Or so we thought. By morning, the tension in my chest had loosened, but only slightly. The house felt different now. The walls seemed to press in tighter, and every sound made my heart jump. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt wrong, like it didn't belong here anymore. Malcolm was in the kitchen, scrubbing the blood, or whatever it was, off the floor. I stood in the doorway, watching him work with the same quiet determination he'd shown the night before. "Why now?" I finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. "Why did they come for us?" Malcolm didn't look up. "Because we killed one of them," he said simply. "They don't let that slide." "But we only killed one." "One's enough." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. "How many are there?" Malcolm paused, the sponge in his hand, dripping onto the floor. He finally glanced up at me, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. After cleaning up, Malcolm insisted we burn the body. "There's no other way," he said, hauling the creature's remains into the woods behind the house. "If we bury it, it'll rot, but not the way you'd expect. It'll change, and we don't want that." I didn't argue. I just followed, the metal rod still clutched in my hand like a lifeline. We found a clearing not far from where he'd buried the woman the night before. The ground was still disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. I wondered if she was still down there, if her body was changing too. Malcolm doused the creature in gasoline, the sharp scent stinging my nose. He struck a match and tossed it onto the pile without ceremony. The flames roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the trees. We stood there in silence, watching the thing burn until there was nothing left but ash and charred bone. Back at the house, Malcolm sat me down at the kitchen table. He placed the leather-bound book, the one from the basement, between us. "You need to understand what we're dealing with," he said, his fingers tracing the strange symbols etched into the cover. "This isn't just about Ashford. It's bigger than that." I stared at the book, hesitant to open it. "How long have you been doing this?" Malcolm sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Since before you were born. Since before your father was born." That caught me off guard. "Dad knew." He nodded. He knew enough, but he didn't want to believe it. Thought he could live a normal life, ignore what was out there. Malcolm's eyes darkened. "That's what got him killed." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd spent years resenting my father, blaming him for leaving, for the distance between us. But now, knowing he'd been tangled in this nightmare too, it changed things. "What about Grandma?" I asked quietly. Malcolm's face hardened. "She was the first one I lost to them." The room felt colder suddenly, the weight of his words settling over us like a shroud. Malcolm opened the book, flipping through pages filled with strange diagrams and notes written in a language I didn't recognize. He stopped at a page near the middle, tapping his finger against an old, faded photograph. It was a group of people standing in front of what looked like a church, but their faces... Something was wrong with their faces. The features were blurred, distorted, as if the photograph itself couldn't fully capture them. "They call themselves the Order of the Veil," Malcolm said. "They protect the intruders, help them blend in, keep people like us from getting too close." "They're human?" I asked, though the word felt foreign on my tongue. Malcolm nodded. "Human, but twisted. They've been seduced by the promise of power, longevity. They think they're on the winning side." "And what happens if they find us?" "They will." His voice was flat, certain. "It's not a matter of if, Ethan. It's when." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Malcolm taught me everything he could, how to recognize the signs, how to fight, how to survive. We fortified the house, setting traps and securing every possible entry point. But no matter how many precautions we took, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. On the third night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard it. A knock at the door. Not loud, not frantic. Just a steady, deliberate knock. Malcolm froze, his eyes narrowing. He motioned for me to stay back as he approached the door, his hand resting on the pistol tucked into his waistband. "Who is it?" he called, his voice steady. There was a pause, then a reply. "It's Deputy Collins." My blood ran cold. The name was familiar, the deputy who'd called me when my father died. But something about his voice didn't sound right. It was too calm, too flat. Malcolm glanced at me, his expression unreadable. He motioned for me to grab the metal rods from the basement. I moved quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned, Malcolm was still at the door, his hand hovering over the lock. "Open it," he whispered, "but be ready." I nodded, tightening my grip on the rod. Malcolm unlocked the door and swung it open. Deputy Collins stood on the porch, his uniform neat, his expression blank. But his eyes were wrong. Too bright, too wide. They didn't blink. "Evening, Dr. Grayson," he said smoothly. "Mind if I come in?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet hit Collins square in the chest, but he didn't flinch, didn't even react. He just smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of his lips. "That wasn't very polite," he whispered. And then all hell broke loose. Deputy Collins didn't bleed. The shot hit dead center, right where his heart should have been, but he just stood there, that eerie smile stretching wider as the echo of the gunshot faded into the thick night air. I froze, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. It felt like everything, the air, the house, time itself, paused in that awful, unnatural moment. Malcolm didn't freeze. Without hesitation, he fired again, aiming higher this time, the sharp crack of the gunshot snapping me out of my trance. The bullet caught Collins in the shoulder, spinning him slightly, but he didn't fall. Instead, he straightened, his head tilting slightly to the side, like he was curious. Then, he took a step forward. Malcolm cursed under his breath, dropping the empty pistol and pulling the metal rod from his belt. "Ethan," he barked, "now!" I didn't need him to say it twice. I lunged forward, gripping the rod so tightly my knuckles turned white. Collins turned his gaze to me, his eyes gleaming like glass under the dim porch light. That smile never left his face, even as I drove the rod straight into his chest, right where Malcolm had shot him. The moment the rod made contact, Collins let out a sound I'll never forget, a mix between a hiss and a gurgle, like air escaping from a punctured lung. His body convulsed, his limbs twitching violently as he stumbled backward off the porch. Then he was still. I stood there, panting, staring at his body sprawled on the ground. But something wasn't right. His eyes, those two bright, too wide eyes, were still open, still watching. "Ethan!" Malcolm's voice snapped me out of it. "Get inside!" I didn't hesitate. I bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind me. Malcolm was already moving, locking it tight and pulling the curtains shut. "They know we're here now," he muttered, grabbing another rod from the stash we kept near the entryway. "We don't have much time." I stared at him, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" "One of them," Malcolm said grimly, "or at least something close." I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. He called me when Dad died. I talked to him on the phone. He sounded normal. They always sound normal. Malcolm's eyes darkened. Until they don't. The rest of the night passed in a blur of adrenaline and fear. We didn't know how many more were out there, but we knew they wouldn't stop with Collins. They never did. We fortified the house as best we could, reinforcing the windows and doors, setting traps around the perimeter. Malcolm moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, too many times, if I had to guess. I followed his lead, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. By dawn, the house felt like a fortress, but it did little to ease the knot of fear tightening in my chest. I kept replaying the night in my head, Colin's too wide smile, his glassy eyes, the way his body twitched when the rod pierced his chest. "Ethan," Malcolm said, breaking me from my thoughts. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the leather-bound book open in front of him. "Sit down." I hesitated, then did as he asked, sinking into the chair across from him. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something I should have told you sooner." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" Malcolm's eyes met mine, and for the first time since I arrived in Ashford, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in them. "They're not just after us because of what we've done," he said. "They're after you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Me? Why?" "Because you're different." His jaw clenched. "You always have been." I stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, faded photograph. He slid it across the table toward me. It was a picture of my parents, taken long before I was born. They looked happy, younger than I ever remembered them. But there was something off about the photo, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw it. Standing behind them, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure, tall, thin, with eyes that gleamed just like Colin's. "Who is that?" I whispered, my throat dry. Malcolm's expression darkened. "That's the thing that took your mother." The room felt like it tilted, the floor dropping out from under me. "What do you mean, took her?" My voice cracked, the words barely making it out. Malcolm sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Your mother wasn't like other people, Ethan. She was connected to them, whether she knew it or not." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's not possible." "I wish it wasn't." His voice was softer now, tinged with something that sounded like regret. "But it's the truth. and it's why they want you." I stared at the photo, my mind spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my life, was unraveling right in front of me. "So, what do we do now?" I finally asked, my voice hollow. Malcolm closed the book, his gaze hardening. "We find them before they find you." We didn't have to look far. By midday, the phone rang. The old landline in the kitchen, one we hadn't touched since I arrived. Malcolm answered on the second ring, his voice tense. "Grayson." I watched him closely, trying to read his expression as he listened, but his face was stone, giving nothing away. Then he hung up. "They're here," he said simply. Before I could ask who, there was a knock at the door. Not frantic this time, calm, deliberate, just like Collins. Malcolm grabbed his gun, motioning for me to stay back as he approached the door. I clutched the metal rod in my hand, my palms slick with sweat. "Who is it?" Malcolm called. A familiar voice answered. "It's Sheriff Hawthorne. Open the door, Malcolm. We need to talk." My blood turned to ice. I remembered Sheriff Hawthorne from when I was a kid. He was a big man, with a booming laugh and kind eyes. But now, all I could hear was Colin's voice in my head, smooth and steady, asking to come inside. Malcolm didn't move. He stared at the door, his jaw clenched. "Ethan," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the door. "Get ready." The words barely left his mouth before the front window shattered. The window shattered in a cascade of glass, spraying across the floor like 1,000 tiny daggers. I hit the ground instinctively, heart pounding, as the cold air from outside rushed into the house. Malcolm didn't flinch. He was already moving, raising his gun and firing toward the window's gaping hole. I barely had time to process what was happening. Shadows moved outside, quick, too quick to be human. A low, guttural sound echoed through the broken glass, somewhere between a growl and a hiss, and my blood ran cold. "They're inside the perimeter," Malcolm barked, snapping me out of my daze. "Move, Ethan!" I scrambled to my feet, gripping the metal rod like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Malcolm was already at the back of the house, motioning for me to follow. We couldn't hold them off from here. We had to fall back. We darted through the narrow hallway, the old wooden floors creaking beneath our feet. Behind us, I could hear the front door splintering, the sound of heavy boots stomping over broken glass. They were inside. "Basement," Malcolm ordered. We barreled down the basement stairs, slamming the heavy door shut behind us. Malcolm shoved a steel bar through the handle, locking it in place. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it would buy us time. The basement was dimly lit, the single bulb flickering above us like it was about to give out. The familiar smell of damp earth and old wood filled the air, but there was no time to focus on that. "They're not going to stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Malcolm checked the magazine in his pistol, his jaw tight. "They never do." I felt like I was going to be sick. My mind raced through 1,000 questions, but none of them mattered now. There was only one thing left to do: survive. The pounding on the basement door started slow, deliberate, but it didn't stay that way. Within seconds, it turned into a cacophony of fists and claws, raking against the wood, trying to tear through. The door shuddered under the pressure. "They're going to get in," I said, my voice shaking. Malcolm didn't look at me. His eyes were on the far wall of the basement, the heavy steel vault door he'd shown me days before. "Then we make a stand." He crossed the room, spinning the wheel on the vault door until it creaked open. The smell of disinfectant and cold metal wafted out. It was a sterile, lifeless space, but it was fortified. If we could get inside and seal the door, maybe we had a chance. Inside. Now. I hesitated for a split second, glancing back at the basement door as it rattled on its hinges. Then I bolted into the vault, Malcolm close behind. He slammed the door shut, twisting the wheel until it locked with a heavy clunk. For a moment, everything went still. The only sounds were our ragged breaths echoing off the steel walls. But then we heard it, the scraping of claws against metal. They knew where we were, and they weren't going to stop. The vault felt even smaller now, the walls pressing in as the reality of our situation sank in. We were trapped. "What's the plan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Malcolm was already moving, grabbing supplies from the shelves lining the walls. He tossed me a small metal canister. "Flash charge," he explained. "If they breach the door, it'll give us a few seconds of cover." "If they breach the door?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Malcolm gave me a grim smile. "They will." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the canister in my hands. The idea of facing those things again made my skin crawl, but I knew there was no other choice. We couldn't stay in here forever. "They're not just here for me, are they?" I asked suddenly, the realization hitting me like a freight train. "They're here for you too." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He finished checking his weapons before finally meeting my gaze. "I've been a thorn in their side for a long time," he admitted, "but you're something different." "What does that even mean?" "It means they see you as a threat, or maybe..." His voice trailed off, his expression unreadable. "Maybe they see you as one of them." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, a part of me wondered if he was right. Ever since I arrived in Ashford, I felt off, like something inside me was shifting, changing. The pounding on the vault door grew louder, more frantic. The metal groaned under the pressure, and I knew we didn't have much time. Malcolm loaded the last of his ammo and nodded toward the far wall, where a small, hidden panel was barely visible in the dim light. "There's a tunnel," he said. "Emergency exit. It leads out to the woods." I stared at him, my heart racing. "You've had an escape this whole time and didn't say anything?" "It's not a guaranteed way out," he replied. "They might have it covered, but it's our best shot." The door shuddered violently, the sound reverberating through the vault. They were close. Malcolm grabbed the flash charge from my hand and tucked it into his jacket. "When I say run, you run." "Got it?" I nodded, too scared to argue. The vault door dented inward with a loud clang, and a thin crack split the metal. I could see something moving on the other side, dark shapes, eyes glinting in the dim light. Malcolm pulled a second flash charge from his belt, holding it in his hand like a grenade. He gave me one last look, his eyes steely and determined. "Ready?" I nodded again, my grip tightening on the metal rod in my hand. The door buckled. "Run!" Malcolm shouted, yanking the tunnel door open and tossing the charge behind us. We sprinted into the narrow tunnel, the sound of the explosion behind us rattling the walls. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for us to move side by side, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. The air grew colder as we moved, the dim emergency lights flickering above us. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest, but I kept going. I could hear them behind us, scratching, skittering sounds, inhuman and relentless. We burst out of the tunnel into the woods, the fresh air hitting me like a slap to the face, but there was no time to breathe. "Keep moving," Malcolm barked, dragging me deeper into the forest. Branches whipped against my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. But we didn't stop. We ran until my legs felt like they would give out, until my vision blurred from exhaustion. Finally, we reached a small clearing, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the trees. Malcolm stopped, pulling me behind a large tree. His chest heaved with effort, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness. "We're not safe yet," he whispered, "but we've got a head start." I nodded, trying to catch my breath, but deep down I knew he was right. This wasn't over, not even close. The woods were unnervingly quiet, no birds, no insects, just the distant sound of our labored breathing and the faint rustle of leaves underfoot as we crouched behind the tree, hidden in the shadows. My heart was still pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a war drum. Malcolm scanned the tree line, his eyes sharp, alert. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the metal rod like it was the only thing holding him together. "They'll be tracking us," he whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I nodded, though my throat was too dry to speak. I didn't need him to tell me that. I could feel it, like the forest itself was watching, waiting for us to slip up. "Where do we go?" I finally managed, my voice hoarse. Malcolm's gaze flicked to me, then back to the shadows. "There's a safe house, about 2 miles east near the old mill." He paused, listening to the stillness. "If we can make it there, we can regroup. Plan our next move. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The attack at the house, Deputy Collins, Sheriff Hawthorne. The things I'd seen, the things I felt. None of it made sense. But one thing was crystal clear. We weren't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. "Let's move," Malcolm said, his voice firm. We slipped through the trees, moving as quietly as we could. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, every shadow stretching longer, every branch reaching out like fingers trying to pull us back. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of them right behind us. But the woods stayed eerily empty. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we reached a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the forest. Malcolm motioned for me to follow, his pace quick but careful. We couldn't afford to leave an obvious trail. As we moved, my thoughts kept drifting back to what Malcolm had said in the vault. "They're after you." The words echoed in my head, louder than the sounds of the forest. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that I wasn't some magnet for these things. But deep down, a part of me knew better. I'd felt it since I got here. A pull, a connection I couldn't explain. And it scared the hell out of me. We reached the edge of the old mill, just as the first hints of dawn began to break through the trees. The building was a crumbling relic from a bygone era, its wooden walls warped and weathered by time. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were either shattered or boarded up. But it was shelter, and right now, that's all we needed. Malcolm led me around the back, where a rusted metal door hung crooked on its hinges. He pushed it open with a creak that made my skin crawl, then motioned for me to go inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. Old machinery loomed in the shadows, their rusted gears and belts like the bones of some long-dead creature. But there was something else, too. Something underneath the rot and rust. A feeling, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Malcolm led me to a small room in the back, where the remnants of an old office sat in disarray. A broken desk, a toppled filing cabinet, and a dusty, cracked window that let in just enough light to see the dust dancing in the air. "This will do," he said quietly, closing the door behind us. He dropped his bag on the floor and pulled out a small lantern, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. The soft, flickering glow pushed back the shadows just enough to make the room feel a little less suffocating. I sank into the corner, my legs finally giving out beneath me. My entire body ached. My muscles screamed from the run, my head pounded from exhaustion, and my heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. Malcolm sat across from me, his eyes studying me in the dim light. "You holding up?" he asked. I let out a bitter laugh. "Define holding up." He didn't smile, just nodded, as if he understood. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything pressing down on us like the walls of the mill themselves. But I couldn't stay quiet, not anymore. "What did you mean," I finally said, my voice low, "when you said they're after me?" Malcolm's expression darkened. He leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. "They're not just here for revenge," he said quietly. "They've been watching you, Ethan, long before you came back to Ashford." I frowned, my stomach twisting. "Why?" Malcolm hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a pendant, worn and tarnished, with strange symbols etched into its surface. He tossed it to me, and I caught it, feeling the cold metal against my skin. "That belonged to your mother," he said. I stared at the pendant, my heart pounding. I didn't recognize it. I'd never seen it before, but as I held it, a strange warmth spread through my fingers, up my arm, like the metal itself was alive. "What is this?" I whispered. Malcolm's gaze was hard, unyielding. "It's a mark, a connection. Your mother was part of them, Ethan, whether she knew it or not." I shook my head, my throat tightening. "Number, that's not possible." "It is." His voice was firm. "And it's why they want you. You're connected to them, whether you like it or not." I felt like the room was spinning, the walls closing in. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my life, was slipping through my fingers like sand. "So what?" I snapped. I'm supposed to be one of them? Malcolm's jaw clenched. Number. You're better than them, but that's why you're dangerous. To them. To us. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. You have a choice, Ethan. You can fight this, or you can let it consume you. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. I didn't know what to say, what to think. All I knew was that I couldn't run from this anymore. I was in it, all the way. We stayed in the mill for the rest of the day, resting, regrouping. But as night fell again, the unease returned, settling in my bones like a sickness I couldn't shake. We weren't safe, not here, not anywhere. And deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The night settled over the mill like a suffocating blanket, thick and heavy. Every creak of the old wooden beams, every gust of wind rattling the broken windows made my skin crawl. I sat in the corner of the office, staring at the tarnished pendant Malcolm had given me, turning it over and over in my hand. The symbols etched into the metal seemed to shift under the flickering lantern light, almost like they were alive. I didn't know what they meant, but I could feel something when I touched them, a strange pull deep in my chest, like a string being tugged from the inside out. Your mother was part of them. Malcolm's words echoed in my head, louder than the wind outside. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that this was all some twisted mistake, but the longer I sat there, the harder it was to deny the truth, gnawing at the edges of my mind. There was something wrong with me, and it had been there long before I came back to Ashford. Malcolm sat across the room, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, but his body tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Even in rest, he looked sharp, alert. I wondered if he ever really slept. After what felt like hours, he finally spoke. We can't stay here much longer. I looked up, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. Where do we go? There's a place, he said, opening his eyes. An old church outside town. It's not safe, but it's different. They don't like it. I frowned. Why? Malcolm's jaw tightened. Because it's where it started. I didn't ask what it was. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. We left the mill just before dawn, moving through the woods under the cover of darkness. The forest felt different now, like it was holding its breath. The usual sounds of wildlife were gone, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. Every shadow felt like it was watching. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. We moved quickly, but cautiously, sticking to the trees and avoiding open spaces. Malcolm led the way, his steps sure and silent, while I followed, my grip tight on the metal rod in my hand. I could feel them out there. I didn't know how, but I could. It was like a faint buzzing at the edge of my mind, growing louder the closer they got. But they weren't just following us. They were waiting for something, or someone. The old church sat at the edge of a clearing, its once pristine white paint now faded and peeling, the roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were dark, the glass long since shattered, and the wooden doors hung crooked on their hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but I could feel it, something inside. Malcolm stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line before motioning for me to follow. We moved quickly, crossing the open space and slipping through the broken doors into the dark interior. The air inside was cold, thick with dust, and the faint scent of something metallic, like old blood. The pews were rotting, the floorboards warped and cracked. The altar at the front of the church was broken in half, as if something, or someone, had smashed through it. But it wasn't just the decay that made my skin crawl. It was the silence. Malcolm led me to a small room in the back, what might have once been the pastor's office. He closed the door behind us, barricading it with an old desk, before turning to face me. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where we make our stand." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. What does that even mean? "It means they're coming," he said, his voice steady, "and we can't run anymore." The hours stretched on, the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing minute. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, staring at the cracked ceiling as Malcolm went over our supplies. We had a few metal rods, some homemade explosives, and enough ammo for one last fight. but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. They weren't just coming for Malcolm. They were coming for me. "Why here?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. "What makes this place so special?" Malcolm paused, his hands stilling over the weapons laid out on the floor. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Because this is where your mother died." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Malcolm finally met my eyes, his expression hard. "Your mother brought you here when you were a baby. She thought it was safe, but they found her." I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me, the walls closing in. "She died protecting you," Malcolm continued, his voice low. "But something happened that night. Something changed." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "You're lying." "I wish I was," he said quietly. "But you've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the connection. You're not like them, Ethan, but you're not like us either." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The first sign of them came just as the sun dipped below the horizon. A low, rumbling sound, like a distant growl, echoed through the church. The walls vibrated with it, the floorboards trembling under my feet. "They're here," Malcolm whispered, his eyes narrowing. I gripped the metal rod tighter, my palms slick with sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was inside my head, rattling my thoughts, twisting them into something dark and unrecognizable. Then the windows shattered. Dark shapes poured through the broken glass, their movements too fast, too wrong to be human. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting something ancient, something hungry. Malcolm fired first, the gunshots deafening in the small room. I swung the metal rod at the first one that got close, feeling it connect with a sickening crunch. The thing shrieked, its body convulsing before collapsing to the floor. But there were more, so many more. They swarmed the room, their bodies twisting and contorting, their hands clawing at the walls, the floor, us. Malcolm threw one of the explosives, the blast sending a shockwave through the room. The creatures screamed, their bodies disintegrating into ash and bone. But it wasn't enough. They kept coming, and deep down, I knew why. They weren't here to kill us. They were here to take me. The fight blurred into chaos. Gunfire, screams, the metallic tang of blood in the air. But through it all, I felt something building inside me. A heat, a pressure, like a dam about to burst. Then everything went silent. The creatures froze, their eyes locking onto mine. And I felt it. The connection. The truth. I wasn't just connected to them. I was the key. The reason they were here. The reason they would never stop. And in that moment, as the world crumbled around me, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sure I wanted them to. The creatures froze mid-movement, their glowing eyes locked onto me like I was the center of gravity pulling them in. The room was filled with the scent of burning wood and metal, but all I could focus on was the feeling, that strange, suffocating connection humming beneath my skin. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, something darker. Malcolm's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Ethan, don't listen to them." I didn't even realize they were speaking, not with words at least. It was like their presence was seeping into my mind, whispering things I couldn't quite hear, but somehow understood. Promises, threats, warnings. My grip on the metal rod tightened, knuckles white against the cold steel. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, spreading out through my limbs, making my skin prickle like electricity was crawling just beneath the surface. The creatures inched closer, moving as one, like they were tethered to me by invisible strings. They weren't attacking, not yet. They were waiting. For me. Malcolm stepped into my line of sight, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "You're stronger than this, Ethan. You don't belong to them." But the thing was, I wasn't sure that was true anymore. The tension snapped all at once. One of the creatures lunged, its movements too fast, too fluid to be human, but before I could react, Malcolm was already there. The crack of his gunshot echoed off the crumbling walls, the creature jerking back as the bullet tore through its chest. That broke the spell. Chaos erupted. They swarmed us, their screeches like nails on glass. I swung the metal rod, feeling it connect with a sickening thud against something's skull. The creature crumpled, but two more took its place. Malcolm fired again and again, each shot precise, controlled. But there were too many. For every one that fell, another took its place, their bodies moving with an unnatural jerking rhythm that made my stomach twist. "Back!" Malcolm shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the rear of the church. We stumbled through the wreckage, dodging claws and teeth, until we burst through a door leading to a narrow hallway. The walls were cracked, the floor littered with debris, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. I could hear them behind us, their footsteps a chaotic symphony of scraping claws and splintering wood. They were relentless, and no matter how fast we ran, they were right on our heels. We reached a stairwell at the end of the hall, the steps leading down into darkness. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He shoved me forward, his voice a harsh whisper in my ear. "Go, I'll hold them off." "No," I snapped, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to." His grip tightened on my shoulder, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something else. Fear. "You're the reason they're here, Ethan, but you're also the reason we can stop them." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "I don't even know what I am." Malcolm's expression softened for the briefest moment. "You're my grandson. That's all that matters." Before I could respond, he shoved me down the stairs and slammed the door behind me. I stumbled in the darkness, the sounds of gunfire and screeching creatures echoing from above. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to move, to keep going. I couldn't let his sacrifice be for nothing. The stairwell led to an old crypt beneath the church, the air damp and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The walls were lined with crumbling stone, and the faint light from my flashlight cast long, eerie shadows across the ground. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them, not the creatures, them. The whispers grew louder as I moved deeper into the crypt, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The pendant around my neck grew warm, the symbols glowing faintly in the dark. I reached a large chamber at the heart of the crypt, its walls covered in strange markings that pulsed with an otherworldly light. In the center of the room was an altar, and on it lay something I couldn't quite comprehend. It was a mirror, but not like any mirror I'd ever seen. The surface shimmered like liquid silver, reflecting not my face, but something else, something inside me. I saw flashes of memories that weren't mine, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, but they felt familiar, like they'd always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice that echoed in my mind. "You are one of us." I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the voice pressed in, suffocating and relentless. My heart raced, my mind spinning as I struggled to hold on to myself. But then I heard another voice, faint but steady. "Ethan." It was Malcolm. I didn't know how, but I could hear him, feel him. His presence was like a lifeline pulling me back from the edge. "You're stronger than this," his voice whispered in my mind. "You don't belong to them." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand. The mirror pulsed, the reflections twisting and writhing like living things. But I didn't look away. I faced it. "I'm not yours," I whispered, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'll never be yours." The pendant around my neck grew hotter, the symbols burning against my skin. I gripped it tightly, focusing all my energy on that single connection, the one thing that anchored me to who I was, to who I am. The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, the shards dissolving into nothingness before they hit the ground. The whispers stopped, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. But it wasn't over, not yet. I stumbled back up the stairs, my legs weak, but my resolve stronger than ever. The church above was in ruins, the walls caved in, the air thick with smoke and ash. But Malcolm was still standing. He was battered, bloodied, but alive. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of relief in his expression. "They're gone," I whispered. He nodded, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "For now." I moved to his side, helping him stay upright as we made our way out of the church, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. We didn't speak as we walked through the forest, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. We both knew this wasn't the end, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Because I wasn't just running anymore, I was ready to fight. The sun was rising, casting pale light over the forest as Malcolm and I stumbled through the trees. The chill of dawn bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was still spinning from what had happened in the crypt, the mirror, the whispers, the way it had felt like something inside me was trying to claw its way out. But I'd fought it. I was still me, for now. Malcolm leaned heavily on me as we walked, his steps uneven, but his grip on the metal rod was as firm as ever. Even after everything, he wasn't letting his guard down, and neither was I. "They're not done," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They'll come back." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know." We reached the edge of the woods where the old Grayson property stretched out before us. The house was a blackened shell, smoke still rising from the charred remains. The attack had left nothing but ashes and memories. But standing there, looking at the wreckage, I didn't feel fear. I felt determined. "We need to finish this," I said quietly. Malcolm glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "You sure?" I met his gaze, feeling the weight of everything we'd been through settle on my shoulders. "Yeah, I'm sure." We didn't have much time. The creatures might have been driven back for now, but they weren't gone. They were regrouping, waiting for the right moment to strike. And if we didn't act first, there wouldn't be another chance. Malcolm led me to a hidden shed on the edge of the property, half buried beneath vines and overgrowth. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but the shelves were lined with weapons, supplies, and old maps of Ashford and the surrounding areas. "This is where it started," Malcolm said, spreading one of the maps across a rickety table. He pointed to a spot deep in the forest, farther than we'd ever gone before. "And this is where it ends." I stared at the spot he'd marked. It was a place I'd heard whispers about when I was a kid, though no one ever spoke of it openly. The Hollow, a place people avoided, even in daylight. The stories said it was cursed, that people who went in never came out. But now I knew the truth. It wasn't cursed, it was theirs. We moved quickly, gathering everything we'd need: metal rods, flash charges, and the last of our ammunition. But there was something else, too. Something Malcolm pulled from the bottom of a locked chest. It was a knife, but not just any knife. The blade was etched with the same strange symbols as the pendant, its edge gleaming with a faint, unnatural light. Just holding it made my skin prickle, the same way I'd felt in the crypt. "This is the key," Malcolm said, handing it to me. "If we can get to the source, whatever's anchoring them here, this will be how we end it." I nodded, slipping the knife into my belt. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just its weight in metal, like it carried the truth. We set out before the sun was fully up, following the old logging roads that twisted through the forest like veins. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving only the sound of our footsteps crunching against the dirt. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches blocking out what little light filtered through the canopy. It felt like the forest itself was watching, waiting. By midday, we reached the edge of the hollow. It wasn't marked on any map, but we knew when we'd arrived. The trees here were different, taller, darker, their bark warped and cracked like scars. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and the air smelled of rot and decay. But it wasn't just the physical changes. It was the feeling, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, like the forest was alive, and it knew we were here. Malcolm paused, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close," he whispered. We moved carefully, our steps deliberate. The deeper we went, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was like something inside me was trying to guide me, pulling me toward the heart of the forest, toward the source. We found it in a clearing, surrounded by ancient stones, carved with the same symbols as the pendant and the knife. In the center stood an old tree, its bark blackened and split, oozing a thick, dark sap that shimmered in the dim light. But it wasn't just a tree. It was alive. The branches writhed like serpents, twisting and coiling, and at its base, roots pulsed like veins, feeding on something buried deep beneath the soil. I could feel it, the connection. This was the anchor, the heart of the intruder's power. "They're here," Malcolm whispered, his voice tight. I didn't need him to tell me. I could feel them closing in, their presence pressing against the edges of my mind like a storm about to break. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I stepped into the clearing, the knife in my hand. The tree's branches shuddered, and from the shadows, the creatures emerged. Dozens of them. Their eyes glowed in the dim light, their bodies twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. But they didn't attack. They waited. For me. The whispers started again, louder this time, clearer. "You are one of us." But I wasn't. Not really. I raised the knife, feeling the warmth of the symbols burning against my skin. The whispers grew frantic, desperate, but I pushed them aside. I wasn't theirs. I never had been. I drove the knife into the base of the tree. The ground trembled, a deep, guttural sound rumbling through the clearing. The creatures shrieked, their bodies convulsing as the connection shattered. The tree writhed, its branches thrashing wildly, but I didn't let go. The light from the knife spread through the roots, up the trunk, until the entire tree was glowing, the dark sap burning away like paper in a flame. With a final ear-splitting crack, the tree split in two, collapsing into ash. The creatures fell with it, silent, lifeless. When it was over, the forest was quiet again. Malcolm and I stood in the clearing, the weight of what we'd done settling over us. The knife was still in my hand, but the warmth was gone. It was just metal now. "It's over," Malcolm said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I nodded, but I knew the truth. It was never really over. But for the first time, we'd won. And for now, that was enough. We left Ashford behind, the shadows of the past fading with each step. But I carried the memories with me, the battles, the losses, the truth about who I was and who I wasn't. The world was still dark, still filled with things hiding in the shadows. But I wasn't afraid anymore, because I knew who I was. I was Ethan Grayson, and I was ready for whatever came next.